What kind of man would stand in front of a crowd and choose a 60-year-old woman when younger women were right there on the stage? That was the question burning in everyone's mind the day Nathan Perez shocked the entire town. The auction in Cedar Ridge Town Square was loud and cruel. Dust swirled in the hot afternoon sun as people gathered, laughing and trading jokes at the expense of the desperate souls who stood on the wooden platform. These auctions were not for animals. They were for people, men and women with broken lives who had no choice but to sell 7 years of their service just to survive. Dorothy Watson stood on that stage with her hands folded tightly in front of her, trying to keep them from shaking. Her silver hair shone in the sunlight. Her blue eyes held quiet dignity, even as she faced humiliation no person should ever face. At 60 years old, she looked tired, but there was still grace in the way she stood. The auctioneer tried to hype the crowd, but even his voice lacked interest as he announced her. 7 years of service, experienced in household work, he called out, without much hope. No one stepped forward. People snickered, some whispered. Others openly mocked her. She can't lift a bucket, let alone work a ranch. One man joked, she'll fall apart halfway through the first winter. A woman laughed. Dorothy heard every word, but she kept her chin high. She refused to let them see her break. She had already lost everything once. She wouldn't lose her pride, too. The auctioneer sighed and tried again. Do I hear a bid? Silence. Then came the cruelest blow, laughter, loud and sharp, as if her life meant nothing. Dorothy felt the sting of tears, but blinked them away. She would not cry here. Not in front of them. Just when the auctioneer was about to move on and send her off to the poorhouse, a deep voice rose from the back of the crowd. I want the 60-year-old woman. The crowd froze. Heads turned. People stepped aside as a tall, broad-shouldered mountain man walked forward. Nathan Perez. A name that brought both curiosity and fear. He rarely came to town. When he did, he spoke to almost no one. Years of living alone in the mountains had hardened his face like carved stone. His gray eyes were serious, steady, and not the kind you dared to challenge. The silence lasted only a moment before cruel laughter exploded. The mountain man's lost his mind, someone shouted. What's he gonna do with an old woman like that? Another yelled. But Nathan didn't react. His eyes stayed on Dorothy. In that moment, she saw something in his gaze that no one else saw. He wasn't mocking her. He wasn't pitying her. He was looking at her like she still had value. Like she was still a person worth respecting. That was something she hadn't felt in a long time. Before this moment, the entire town had watched Dorothy fall from grace. Just 6 months earlier, she had been the respected wife of a rancher. She hosted church gatherings, helped families in need, and was admired by many. Then, a letter arrived. A foreclosure notice. Her husband had left behind debts she never knew about. Debts so large that the ranch that had been in her family for 3 generations was taken from her. In one terrible day, she lost her land, her home, her security, and the identity she had carried for 40 years. At 60 years old, she had nowhere to go. The auction house was her last chance to avoid starving on the streets. She remembered walking into the auction building earlier that morning, clutching a worn carpet bag. The auction master warned her gently that older women were rarely chosen. People want strong hands, ma'am. Someone who can work fields or handle livestock. A woman your age may not find any takers, she understood. But she had no other path left. Now here she stood, being sold like property, while the crowd mocked her age as if it erased her worth. Nathan stepped closer to the stage. The laughter died down as people moved out of his way. He was a large man, with a quiet strength that demanded respect. He reached the platform, pulled out $50 in gold coins, and placed them in the auctioneer's hand without blinking. The auctioneer slammed the gavel. Sold! Dorothy felt her knees weaken. Relief and fear mixed inside her. She didn't know what this man wanted with her. She had heard the stories. He lived alone in the mountains. People said he didn't talk to anyone. and that he preferred wolves and wilderness to humans. He stepped beside her for the first time and spoke quietly. "Ma'am?" Just one word, but his voice was gentle, kind. It hit her harder than any cruel laugh had. She whispered, "Thank you." She didn't even fully know what she was thanking him for. For choosing her? For saving her from the poorhouse? For seeing her? He simply nodded, turned, and guided her toward his wagon. As she climbed aboard, she felt the stares of the townspeople burning into her back. Some shook their heads, some smirked. Some whispered that she would never survive mountain life, and that Nathan would regret taking her. The wagon began rolling away from Cedar Ridge, leaving behind the life Dorothy had known, and the people who once judged her from their church pews. The journey into the mountains would take 2 days. She didn't know what waited for her at the end of it. But for the first time in months, she felt something she thought she had lost forever. Hope. Dorothy soon learned that the road to Nathan's cabin was not just a path into the mountains. It was a path into a new life. The climb grew steep as the wagon rolled forward, and the sounds of town faded behind them. The deeper they entered the forest, the more Dorothy realized how far she was leaving her old world behind. Nathan drove the wagon in silence, but it wasn't a cold silence. It felt peaceful. He stopped often, making sure she rested, drank water, and ate. No one had cared for her needs like that in a long time. Her husband had provided a house and meals, but kindness was something she had rarely tasted. By sunset, they made camp beside a clear stream. Nathan gathered wood without a word and built a fire. Dorothy watched him move with steady strength, like a man who understood the land. She wondered how someone who lived alone for 15 years could still show gentle manners to a stranger. As they sat by the fire eating simple food, Dorothy finally spoke. "Why did you choose me?" Quote. The flames flickered across Nathan's face. He stared at the fire for a moment before answering. "You look like someone who needed a safe place," he said, "and everyone deserves that." He didn't explain further, but she felt the weight of those words, as if they came from a man who had once needed safety too. They reached the cabin the next evening. Dorothy expected a rough shack, but what stood before her took her breath away. A sturdy log cabin with a stone chimney, a small porch, and a peaceful clearing surrounded by tall pine trees. Smoke curled softly from the chimney, and the air smelled of pine and fresh earth. Nathan carried her carpet bag inside. The cabin was modest but neat. Everything was hand-built with care. Wooden shelves, a table, chairs, and a fireplace that warmed the entire room. There was even a small bookcase with worn books. "You take the bedroom," Nathan said, pointing to a small room at the back. "I'll sleep here by the fire." Dorothy shook her head. "You brought me here. I will not push you out of your own bed." Quote. "It's settled," he said, not unkindly. "You need rest. You've had a long road behind you." His tone left no space for argument, so Dorothy thanked him and went to the bedroom. The bed was simple but clean. She lay down and stared at the wooden ceiling. For the first time in months, she fell asleep without fear. Life in the mountains began slowly for Dorothy. Nathan woke before sunrise every day. She would hear him chopping wood, tending to animals, or fishing before she even stepped outside. He never demanded she do anything. He simply made space for her to find her place. Dorothy needed to feel useful. She began cooking breakfast, sweeping the floors, and washing clothes. The work was hard on her soft hands, but she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. Nathan noticed. "You don't have to do all that," he said one morning. "I want to," she replied softly. "It helps me stand again." He understood. As days passed, they learned about each other in small ways. Dorothy learned that Nathan had lost his wife and baby daughter many years ago during a terrible winter. The pain had pushed him into the mountains where he closed himself off from the world. Dorothy shared that she had once been respected, surrounded by friends, but those friends disappeared the moment she lost everything. People were kind, only when life was easy. Nathan listened, truly listened. Winter came early that year. Snow piled high, trapping them inside at times. Dorothy feared the silence at first, but it became comforting. They spent nights by the fire, Nathan reading from his books, while Dorothy mended shirts or knitted scarves. One night, she found Nathan staring into the fire with tired eyes. She sat beside him without speaking. After a long silence, he whispered, "Sometimes the past comes back when it's quiet." Dorothy placed her hand gently over his. "Then we faced the quiet together." He didn't move his hand away. Winter slowly softened into spring. By then, Dorothy's cheeks were rosier, her steps firmer. She gathered herbs, washed clothes in the stream, and learned to bake bread with the ingredients Nathan traded for. She also noticed Nathan changing. He spoke more, smiled sometimes, even laughed once when she tried to milk a goat and it kicked the bucket over. Spring brought new color to the mountains, and with it, a question that Dorothy had feared and hoped would come. One morning on the porch, as the sunrise painted the peaks gold, Dorothy asked, "Nathan, when my 7 years are done, what happens then?" Nathan took a slow breath. His voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "I was hoping," he said, looking at her with steady gray eyes, "that you would stay because this is where you want to be, not because a contract holds you." Her heart trembled. She didn't answer yet. She needed time. But for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future here. A future not of duty, but of choice. And just when life was settling into something calm and new, trouble arrived. One afternoon, while Dorothy was hanging laundry, she heard horses approaching. Fear rushed through her. She called for Nathan. He stepped outside with his rifle, his jaw tight. 3 men rode into the clearing, the sheriff and 2 deputies. They came for Dorothy. She stood behind Nathan as the sheriff spoke. "We got reports in town saying she's here against her will. We need to hear it from her." Nathan's grip tightened on the rifle, but Dorothy stepped forward. Her voice was firm. "I am here by my own choice. This is my home." The sheriff looked at her long and hard. Then he nodded slowly. "If that's your truth, we won't interfere." They left. Dorothy and Nathan watched them disappear down the trail. What happened next would change everything between them. Wait. Before we move on, what do you think about the story so far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm really curious to know. After the sheriff and his men left, the clearing fell silent. The only sound was the wind moving through the pine trees, but everything felt different. Dorothy turned to Nathan and saw a storm of emotions in his eyes. She had spoken for herself. She had chosen to stay. Not out of fear, not out of debt, but out of her own free will. Nathan lowered the rifle slowly and looked at her with a softness that made her heart tighten. "Thank you," he said quietly. Dorothy shook her head. "No, thank you for giving me a life worth choosing." That night, they sat by the fire without speaking much. They didn't need words. Something had shifted between them. Something deeper than duty or gratitude. They were no longer a man who rescued a woman or a woman who needed shelter. They were becoming each other's home. The winter that followed was the most peaceful either of them had known. They worked side by side in everything. Dorothy cooked, cleaned, and kept the cabin warm. Nathan hunted, chopped wood, and repaired tools. But they did those things with a new sense of togetherness. Some nights, as the fire warmed the cabin, Dorothy would read out loud while Nathan carved wood. Other nights, Nathan would share stories of mountain life, of the animals he watched, the seasons he survived, and the quiet lessons the mountains had taught him. But the biggest change came in spring. Their cabin slowly became a place people sought out. It started with Maria, a young, pregnant girl who had nowhere to go. Dorothy took one look at her and felt the ache of her own empty arms from years past. She invited Maria in without hesitation, and Nathan agreed. They gave her care, safety, and a place to rest. When Maria's baby girl was born, Dorothy and Nathan stood beside her like family. When Maria left months later, she was stronger, braver, and hopeful again. After that, word began to spread. Slowly, more broken souls found their way to the mountain for shelter, healing, or a second chance. Some stayed days, some weeks, a few stayed longer. Dorothy and Nathan helped each one leave stronger than they arrived. People in Cedar Ridge heard rumors. They said the mountain man and the old woman were running a sanctuary. Some mocked it. Some didn't believe it. But many respected them secretly. because everyone knew someone who had gone up the mountain with a shattered heart and returned with a lighter one. Years passed gently. Dorothy was no longer the fragile, heartbroken woman who stood on that auction platform. She was strong. Her hands were rough and capable. Her back was straight. Her laughter was warm. She moved around the cabin and land with purpose, like she belonged to the mountain as much as the pine trees and the river did. Nathan had changed, too. The man who once hid from the world now welcomed strangers with a calm smile. The bitterness in his heart had faded, replaced with a quiet joy only companionship could bring. On the second anniversary of her arrival, the mountains were covered in a blanket of glowing autumn colors. Dorothy and Nathan stood on the porch, watching the sun set behind the peaks. She was 62 now, he in his late 50s. They had aged, but they had bloomed too. Dorothy looked up at him. "Do you ever regret choosing me?" Nathan turned to her, gray eyes warm, not for a single breath. "Choosing you saved my life just as much as it saved yours." Dorothy's heart swelled. She reached for his hand. He held it with gentle strength. "You gave me dignity when I had none left," she said. "You reminded me I was still a person, not a burden, not a forgotten woman. And you gave me purpose," Nathan replied. "You filled a home that was empty. You brought light back into a life that had gone dark." They stood that way for a long moment, letting the silence speak for them. As the stars appeared above the cabin, Dorothy rested her head on Nathan's shoulder. The world had judged them, laughed at them, mocked the mountain man for choosing a 60-year-old woman. But those voices had faded long ago. What remained was a legacy of healing, kindness, and second chances. Their love was not loud or fiery. It was steady, safe, kind. A love built with patience and trust. A love that grew stronger with each passing season. People in Cedar Ridge whispered their story for years. Some told it as a tale of foolishness, others as a miracle. But those who truly understood called it something else. A reminder that love can arrive at any age. A lesson that the value of a soul is not measured by youth, beauty, or strength, but by the heart it carries. The mountain man had chosen the 60-year-old woman when the world laughed at him. But in the end, it was the world that had been blind. Nathan and Dorothy built a life richer than anything money, youth, or status could buy. A life made of peace, respect, companionship, and quiet love. And for the rest of their days, they faced the mountain mornings and star-filled nights together, grateful for the day a lonely man stood in front of a cruel crowd and saw the worth no one else could see.